Putin's People, How the KGB Took Back Russia and Then Took on the West by Catherine Belton. Published in 2020. In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union solidified its grip on power by establishing the Committee for State Security, better known as the KGB. Founded in 1954, the organization became a formidable force in advancing the Kremlin's agenda globally while ruthlessly suppressing dissent at home. Dubbed the sword and shield of the Communist Party, the KGB amassed vast capabilities and influence during the Cold War era. Although the organization formally disbanded after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Catherine Belton, in her book Putin's People, How the KGB Took Back Russia and Then Took on the West, illustrates how the KGB's power structure never truly dissolved. Instead, it merely transformed, shifting its operatives from the shadows to the upper echelons of post-Soviet Russia, with Vladimir Putin leading the charge. Belton, a former Moscow-based correspondent for the Financial Times, meticulously traces the evolution of Russian intelligence officers, particularly Putin, from obscure operatives to power brokers entrenched in the Kremlin. She paints a vivid portrait of Putin's early years in the KGB, starting with his assignment to Dresden, East Germany, in 1985. Despite the scant details available about his time there, Belton, relying on first-hand interviews, contends that Putin and his fellow KGB officers were far more active than officially acknowledged. She asserts that they weren't merely liaising with East German intelligence, the Stasi, but were also conducting covert operations against the West. Among their activities was allegedly supporting the Red Army faction, a left-wing terrorist group responsible for bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations in West Germany. Although much of Putin's work in Dresden remains shrouded in secrecy, Belton suggests that his time there was crucial in cementing connections within the intelligence community, ties that would later prove instrumental in propelling him to the highest office in Russia. Upon his return to Russia after the Berlin Wall's collapse, Putin was posted to Leningrad, soon to be renamed St. Petersburg. The KGB assigned him a seemingly innocuous position at Leningrad State University, working under the rector's office. It was here that Putin reconnected with Anatoly Sobchak, a former law professor who had become a prominent figure in the burgeoning democracy movement sweeping through Russia. Sobchak, soon to become the mayor of St. Petersburg, became a vital patron to Putin, allowing him to leverage his KGB contacts to maintain influence within the city's power circles. According to Belton, Putin displayed a chameleon-like ability to adapt to the shifting political winds. He was, as Belton writes, a mirror to everyone around him. He seamlessly transitioned between the democratic reformers who sought to bring change to Russia and the KGB's old guard, who remained deeply embedded in the state's security apparatus. This duality enabled him to gain favor with both factions, positioning him as a man who could bridge the divide between the old Soviet elite and the new democratic reformers. Rise to power in Moscow, the making of Putin's inner circle. In the chaotic aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, Russia was plunged into economic turmoil. Factories closed, wages evaporated, and ordinary citizens faced crushing poverty. Meanwhile, a select group of opportunistic businessmen and former KGB operatives began amassing vast wealth by exploiting state assets. This was the era of the oligarchs, and for Vladimir Putin, it presented an unprecedented opportunity to rise to power. After successfully navigating the political landscape of St. Petersburg under Mayor Anatoly Sobchak, Putin moved to Moscow in 1996. He was initially appointed to a relatively minor role in the Kremlin's property department, a position that gave him access to a sprawling network of real estate and financial deals. Although this role was not high-profile, it proved invaluable. Putin, a man of few words but keen observation, began to cultivate relationships with powerful businessmen and former KGB officers who were determined to maintain their grip on power. One of Putin's most influential connections was Boris Berezovsky, a tycoon who had amassed a fortune in the car industry and later extended his reach into media and oil. Berezovsky was emblematic of the new breed of Russian oligarchs, ruthlessly ambitious, intensely connected, and unafraid to use his wealth to sway political outcomes. He became a kingmaker in the Kremlin, and Putin, with his KGB background and aura of discretion, was the perfect protégé. According to Belton, Berezovsky initially saw Putin as a malleable figure, someone who could be controlled and leveraged to protect his business interests. But Putin was not a mere puppet. As he gained the trust of President Boris Yeltsin and his powerful family clan, Putin began to consolidate power, gradually sidelining his former benefactors. In 1998, Putin was appointed head of the Federal Security Service, FSB, the successor to the KGB. This was a turning point. As FSB chief, Putin gained access to sensitive intelligence files and learned the extent of corruption and criminal connections among Russia's oligarchs. It was a powerful position that allowed him to amass damaging information on nearly every prominent figure in the country. Putin's strategy became clear: he would leverage the compromising material to assert control over the oligarchs while projecting an image of stability and law and order to the Russian public. Berezovsky, still under the illusion that he was in control, lobbied for Putin to be appointed as prime minister in 1999. Yeltsin, whose health was rapidly declining, agreed. Less than 6 months later, Yeltsin unexpectedly announced his resignation on New Year's Eve 1999, handing over the presidency to Putin. In his farewell address, Yeltsin described Putin as a man who could unite the country and ensure continuity. But for Putin, the transition marked the end of Yeltsin's chaotic, oligarch-dominated era and the beginning of a new autocratic order led by former KGB men. The Second Chechen War, the path to absolute power. Putin's ascent to the presidency coincided with a period of national crisis. In September 1999, a series of apartment bombings rocked Moscow and other Russian cities, killing hundreds of civilians. The Kremlin quickly blamed the attacks on Chechen separatists, igniting a wave of nationalist fervor. Putin seized the moment, vowing to crush the insurgents with unrelenting force. Belton meticulously details how the apartment bombings became a pivotal event in Putin's rise. The FSB, under Putin's control, presented evidence of Chechen involvement, but the investigation was marred by inconsistencies and a lack of transparency. Some critics, including former FSB agents and investigative journalists, alleged that the bombings were a false flag operation orchestrated by the FSB to justify a new war in Chechnya and solidify Putin's image as a strong, decisive leader. Belton delves into the mysterious case of the Ryazan incident, where a suspicious package was discovered in the basement of an apartment building. Local police initially identified the contents as explosives, but the FSB later claimed it was a training exercise involving sacks of sugar. This explanation did little to quell suspicions and fueled rumors that the Kremlin had staged the attacks to rally the country around Putin. Regardless of the truth, the bombings served their purpose. Putin launched a brutal military campaign in Chechnya, portraying himself as the protector of Russian sovereignty. His approval ratings soared, and in the March 2000 presidential election, he secured a decisive victory. Consolidating power, the clampdown on oligarchs. Once in power, Putin wasted little time in reining in the oligarchs who had flourished under Yeltsin. His strategy was clear: those who pledged loyalty to the Kremlin could keep their fortunes, but those who dared to challenge him would be destroyed. Boris Berezovsky, who had once considered himself Putin's patron, became one of the first targets. Belton describes how Berezovsky's media empire, including the influential ORT television network, was effectively seized by the state. Berezovsky fled to London, where he would spend the rest of his life in self-imposed exile, issuing dire warnings about Putin's authoritarian ambitions. Another prominent oligarch to fall was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the head of Yukos Oil. Khodorkovsky, once Russia's richest man, dared to criticize Putin publicly and funded opposition political parties. In response, the Kremlin launched a full-scale attack. Khodorkovsky was arrested in 2003 and charged with tax evasion and fraud, charges widely seen as politically motivated. Yukos was dismantled and absorbed by state-owned Rosneft, consolidating the Kremlin's control over the oil sector. Belton argues that the takedown of Khodorkovsky was not just a warning to other oligarchs, it was a signal to the world that Russia was now under the firm grip of the KGB elite. Putin had transformed the presidency into a fortress of power, fortified by loyal security officials and secret police veterans. The Kremlin was no longer just a seat of government, it had become the epicenter of a shadowy network of former KGB men who now controlled vast sectors of the Russian economy. Strategic use of energy, the Kremlin's economic weapon. With the oligarchs subdued and power firmly centralized, Putin's next move was to assert Russia's dominance over its vast energy reserves. Oil and gas had always been vital to the Russian economy, but under Putin, they became strategic assets wielded as tools of political leverage. According to Belton, the transformation of Russia's energy sector was not just about accumulating wealth, it was about consolidating power. The Kremlin began reasserting control over major energy companies that had been privatized in the chaotic 1990s. Gazprom, the state-controlled gas giant, became a central player in Putin's strategy. Once a disorganized and corrupt enterprise, Gazprom was reorganized and brought under Kremlin control. Putin installed loyal allies in key positions, including Alexei Miller, a former KGB operative, as CEO. The new management enforced strict discipline, eliminating independent voices and redirecting profits to Kremlin coffers. Under Putin's watch, Gazprom transformed into a geopolitical weapon. It was no longer just a gas company, it was a state apparatus used to exert pressure on neighboring countries. One of the most notable examples of this strategy occurred in 2006, when Gazprom abruptly cut off gas supplies to Ukraine during a bitter pricing dispute. The timing was crucial. Ukraine had recently undergone the Orange Revolution, a pro-Western uprising that threatened to pull the country out of Russia's sphere of influence. By weaponizing gas, Putin sent a chilling message: defy the Kremlin, and you'll freeze. Belton underscores how the Kremlin also extended its energy dominance beyond Ukraine. Europe's heavy reliance on Russian gas became a powerful bargaining chip. Germany, for example, became deeply dependent on Russian energy, with projects like the Nord Stream pipeline cementing Moscow's grip on European markets. Putin's strategy was clear: maintain Europe's energy dependence while positioning Russia as an indispensable supplier. This strategy enabled the Kremlin to exert subtle but effective political influence over European leaders, discouraging them from criticizing Russia's domestic and foreign policies. International expansion, a new era of global influence. As Russia consolidated its control over strategic sectors at home, Putin's inner circle began expanding their reach internationally. The 2000s witnessed a surge of Russian investments abroad, particularly in sectors like energy, banking, and real estate. Many of these investments were facilitated by Putin's loyal KGB network, who operated behind a web of offshore entities and shell companies. Belton explores the role of London, which emerged as a hub for Russian money laundering and influence operations. Russian billionaires, many with direct ties to the Kremlin, bought lavish properties, established trusts, and funneled billions into Western financial markets. One such figure was Roman Abramovich, who acquired the English football club Chelsea, transforming it into a global powerhouse. Abramovich's wealth and influence in London provided a convenient cover for the Kremlin's deeper objectives, expanding its soft power and forging connections with influential Western politicians and business leaders. In New York, the pattern was similar. Russian oligarchs invested heavily in Manhattan real estate, purchasing iconic properties and establishing links with American financiers. These investments were not purely financial, they served as a means of embedding Kremlin-linked operatives within Western power structures. Belton details how these networks operated under the radar, often through shadowy intermediaries and offshore accounts. While ostensibly legitimate investments, they served as conduits for laundering illicit profits and extending Russia's influence into the West. The political assassin, a chilling new reality. As Putin's power consolidated, the Kremlin's tactics became increasingly ruthless. Critics and defectors who dared to speak out against the regime faced grave consequences. Belton meticulously examined several high-profile assassinations that shook the international community, each marked by chilling precision and brazen impunity. One of the most notorious cases was the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB officer who fled to London and became an outspoken critic of Putin. In 2006, Litvinenko was poisoned with polonium-210, a highly radioactive substance that caused a slow, agonizing death. Litvinenko's death was not just a murder, it was a public execution. On his deathbed, he accused Putin of orchestrating the attack, declaring that the Kremlin had crossed a line by using a nuclear toxin in a foreign country. The British investigation traced the poison to two Russian agents, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, but Moscow refused to extradite them. The message was clear: Russia would eliminate its enemies with impunity, even on foreign soil. Belton also delves into the case of Boris Nemtsov, a prominent opposition leader and vocal critic of Putin. In 2015, Nemtsov was shot dead near the Kremlin in what appeared to be a meticulously planned hit. Despite widespread outrage, the investigation was stifled, and the masterminds remained at large. These assassinations, along with the poisoning of former double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in Salisbury, England, revealed a darker side of Putin's regime. The Kremlin was willing to deploy lethal force against its perceived enemies, sending a stark warning to dissidents everywhere: no one is beyond the reach of Moscow. The 2016 U.S. election, a new dimension of influence. The Kremlin's influence operations reached their apex during the 2016 U.S. presidential election. According to Belton, the roots of the operation can be traced back to the Cold War, when the KGB honed its techniques in propaganda, disinformation, and political subversion. Under Putin, these tactics were revived and refined for the digital age. The 2016 election was a masterclass in hybrid warfare. Kremlin-linked operatives targeted American social media platforms, spreading divisive content designed to inflame racial, political, and cultural tensions. Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube became battlegrounds for Russian disinformation campaigns. Fake news articles were disseminated to millions of users, creating a web of conspiracy theories and false narratives that undermine public trust in democratic institutions. The operation was spearheaded by the Internet Research Agency, IRA, a shadowy organization run by Yevgeny Prigozhin, a close associate of Putin. The IRA employed hundreds of trolls who posed as American citizens, posting inflammatory content to exacerbate existing divisions. Meanwhile, Russian hackers targeted the Democratic National Committee, DNC, stealing thousands of emails and documents that were later leaked to the public. The operation aimed to discredit Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton and sow chaos within the American political system. While the extent of direct collusion between the Trump campaign and the Kremlin remains a subject of ongoing debate, Belton highlights the broader implications. The 2016 election marked a turning point in global politics. The Kremlin had successfully weaponized information, exploiting the vulnerabilities of open democracies to further its strategic objectives. Controlling the media, information as a weapon. Beyond financial warfare, Putin's regime understood the power of narrative control. Media manipulation became a cornerstone of the Kremlin's strategy, allowing Putin to craft his image as a strong, decisive leader while discrediting opponents and spreading disinformation. Upon taking office, Putin prioritized bringing Russia's independent media under state control. The first major target was NTV, a popular television network known for its investigative reporting and critical stance toward the Kremlin. NTV's owner, Vladimir Putin, was arrested on charges of embezzlement, and the network was forcibly taken over by the state-run Gazprom Media. Belton examines how the Kremlin employed the same strategy against other media outlets. Boris Berezovsky, once a powerful media mogul and Yeltsin ally, lost control of Channel 1 after falling out of favor with Putin. He fled to London, where he became a vocal critic of the regime and a target of Kremlin assassins. Once the major media outlets were brought under state control, the Kremlin launched a relentless propaganda campaign. News programs portrayed Putin as a defender of Russian sovereignty, a strongman standing against Western encroachment. Meanwhile, opposition figures were demonized as traitors and foreign agents. Putin's propaganda machine was not limited to domestic audiences. Russia Today, RT, a state-funded international news network, became a powerful tool for disseminating Kremlin narratives abroad. RT produced slick, well-funded content that undermined Western governments, fueled conspiracy theories, and sowed distrust in democratic institutions. The power of fear, cultivating a culture of obedience. Putin's reign was not only built on wealth and propaganda, it was also sustained by fear. The KGB had long mastered the art of psychological warfare, and under Putin, these tactics were refined and expanded. One of the most chilling examples was the assassination of journalist Anna Politkovskaya in 2006. Politkovskaya, a fearless critic of Putin's human rights abuses in Chechnya, was gunned down in her apartment building on Putin's birthday. The message was unmistakable: dissent would be met with death. Belton details other cases as well, such as the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko in London, the shooting of opposition leader Boris Nemtsov near the Kremlin, and the attack on anti-corruption activist Alexei Navalny, who narrowly survived poisoning by a military-grade nerve agent. These assassinations were not random acts of violence, they were calculated, highly visible, and designed to intimidate. The Kremlin wanted its enemies to know that they were being watched, that they were vulnerable, and that there would be no escape. Inside Russia, the culture of fear extended to the business world. Executives and oligarchs were constantly reminded that their fortunes and lives depended on unwavering loyalty to the Kremlin. Those who defied the regime were systematically destroyed, stripped of their assets, imprisoned, or forced into exile. Manipulating Western democracies, infiltration and influence. As Putin consolidated power within Russia, he set his sights on Western democracies, exploiting their openness to infiltrate political systems, financial markets, and influential institutions. Belton meticulously details how the Kremlin leveraged its vast financial networks to cultivate influential allies, fund political movements, and spread disinformation. One of the most significant tactics involved the use of oligarchs and state-controlled enterprises as Trojan horses. Wealthy businessmen like Roman Abramovich, Oleg Deripaska, and Alisher Usmanov operated as unofficial Kremlin envoys, establishing themselves as legitimate business moguls while discreetly advancing Russian state interests. These oligarchs invested in prestigious Western companies, bought luxurious properties, and developed relationships with politicians, effectively weaving themselves into the fabric of Western elite circles. Deripaska, in particular, exemplifies this strategy. A close ally of Putin, he rose to prominence as one of Russia's most powerful industrialists, controlling vast aluminum assets. In the West, he mingled with top politicians and even hired influential lobbyists to smooth his path. However, as Belton reveals, behind his business acumen was a man deeply embedded in Putin's network, using his wealth and influence to gain leverage over key figures in the United States and Europe. Similarly, Russian state-controlled banks like VEB and Gazprom Bank played pivotal roles in extending the Kremlin's financial reach abroad. These institutions financed lucrative projects and acquisitions, seemingly driven by profit motives but ultimately guided by political objectives. VEB, for instance, was implicated in efforts to gain access to sensitive American technology and intelligence, using well-placed intermediaries to navigate complex regulatory systems. Cultivating political chaos, funding extremist movements. Beyond economic infiltration, the Kremlin sought to destabilize Western democracies by funding extremist political movements. Putin understood that sowing division and undermining social cohesion could weaken adversaries more effectively than direct confrontation. Belton outlines how Russian operatives funneled money to far-right and far-left political parties across Europe, fueling nationalist, anti-EU, and anti-immigration sentiments. In France, the National Front, led by Marine Le Pen, received millions in loans from Kremlin-linked banks. This funding came as Le Pen campaigned against EU sanctions on Russia and advocated for closer relations with Moscow. In the United Kingdom, Russian money flooded into London's financial sector, earning the capital the notorious moniker Londongrad. Russian billionaires bought up prime real estate, football clubs, and media outlets, while also donating to political campaigns. This influx of wealth had a corrosive effect on British politics, as wealthy Russians gained influence over political figures, think tanks, and even intelligence operatives. Meanwhile, in the United States, Kremlin-linked operatives exploited the openness of American democracy to influence public opinion. The 2016 presidential election became a focal point of Russian interference, with Moscow using social media disinformation campaigns to polarize voters and amplify divisive narratives. Through well-funded troll farms and fake news websites, Russian operatives spread conspiracy theories, targeted specific demographics, and sought to discredit Hillary Clinton while boosting Donald Trump's candidacy. The objective was not just to sway the election but to undermine public confidence in American democracy itself. Compromising leaders, the art of compromat. In Russia, the KGB had long perfected the art of compromat, compromising material used to blackmail, manipulate, or discredit targets. Under Putin, this tactic was refined and exported globally, with devastating effectiveness. Belton provides a chilling account of how the Kremlin systematically collected damaging information on influential Western leaders, businessmen, and diplomats. The goal was to create leverage that could be used to coerce or control these individuals, ensuring their cooperation or silence. The most infamous example of compromat involved Donald Trump. During a 2013 visit to Moscow for the Miss Universe pageant, Trump stayed at the Ritz-Carlton, a hotel widely known to be under constant surveillance by Russian intelligence. Although the contents of what was allegedly recorded remain speculative, the Kremlin's reputation for collecting compromising material raised concerns about potential leverage over Trump throughout his presidency. But Trump was not the only target. Belton outlines how the Kremlin used compromat to control various influential figures, from European politicians to business executives. In some cases, compromising footage was leaked to the press, while in others, it was held back to ensure continued compliance. Compromat was not limited to personal indiscretions. Financial records, secret deals, and tax evasion schemes were also weaponized to keep targets in line. Those who refused to cooperate found themselves facing public scandals, legal troubles, or worse. Weaponizing energy, the gas pipeline strategy. Putin's rise to power coincided with Russia's emergence as a major energy superpower. By controlling vast oil and gas reserves, the Kremlin gained significant leverage over European countries dependent on Russian energy. Belton describes how this economic weapon was wielded to great effect, turning gas pipelines into political tools. Gazprom, Russia's state-owned energy giant, became the Kremlin's primary instrument of energy diplomacy. The company secured lucrative contracts with European countries, offering gas at favorable rates to nations that aligned with Moscow's interests, while cutting off supplies or imposing exorbitant prices on those that resisted. One of the most striking examples was Ukraine. In 2006 and 2009, Gazprom abruptly cut gas supplies to Ukraine, plunging the country into crisis and sending shockwaves across Europe. These incidents served as stark reminders of the power Putin held over Europe's energy security. Belton highlights how Gazprom's influence extended beyond Ukraine. In Germany, the Nord Stream pipeline project became a key geopolitical battleground. Pitched as a commercial venture, the pipeline was in fact a strategic effort to bypass Ukraine and consolidate Russia's control over European energy supplies. Former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, who became chairman of Nord Stream after leaving office, was a key ally in the project, raising concerns about how deeply Russian influence had penetrated European politics. The poisoned chalice, assassinations and intimidation. Putin's regime was not content to simply intimidate or compromise its opponents, it was willing to eliminate them. Under Putin, political assassinations became a grim hallmark of Russian statecraft, with poison emerging as the weapon of choice. Belton delves into the high-profile killings of Kremlin critics, such as Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB officer turned dissident who was poisoned with radioactive polonium-210 in London in 2006. Litvinenko's murder, carried out in broad daylight, was a brazen act of state terrorism, sending a chilling message to other defectors and critics. Another shocking case was the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in Salisbury, England, in 2018. The attack, carried out with the deadly nerve agent Novichok, underscored the Kremlin's willingness to deploy military-grade toxins against perceived enemies, even on foreign soil. Belton also recounts the attempted assassination of Alexei Navalny, Russia's leading opposition figure. In August 2020, Navalny was poisoned with Novichok while traveling in Siberia. He narrowly survived, and subsequent investigations traced the attack to agents linked to the FSB. These attacks were not isolated incidents, they were part of a broader strategy to eliminate dissent, silence whistleblowers, and intimidate anyone who dared to challenge the Kremlin's authority. The global implications of Putin's power play. The tactics employed by Vladimir Putin and his inner circle have not only reshaped Russia but also sent shockwaves through the global order. From the covert acquisition of wealth through state-controlled enterprises to the systematic infiltration of Western political systems, Putin has demonstrated a masterclass in 21st-century power consolidation. The West, caught off guard by the scale and sophistication of Russia's influence operations, has struggled to mount a coordinated response. The Kremlin's strategic use of compromising material, has allowed it to manipulate politicians and business leaders far beyond Russia's borders. The practice of gaining leverage through covert surveillance, financial entanglements, and even blackmail has created a shadow network of influence, blurring the lines between business, politics, and espionage. This network, constructed meticulously by former KGB operatives, has ensnared oligarchs, politicians, and even media magnates, effectively rendering them agents of the Kremlin's will. Simultaneously, Russia's exploitation of nationalist and extremist movements has further destabilized democratic institutions. By bankrolling far-right political parties and disseminating disinformation, the Kremlin has weaponized division and discontent, eroding public trust in democratic systems. The ripple effects of these efforts can be seen across Europe and the United States, where political polarization and distrust of mainstream media have reached unprecedented levels. Moreover, Putin's weaponization of energy resources has underscored the vulnerability of Europe's energy security. By monopolizing gas supplies and manipulating prices, the Kremlin has effectively held entire nations hostage, leveraging energy dependence as a geopolitical weapon. The 2006 and 2009 gas crises, in which Russia cut off supplies to Ukraine, served as stark warnings to Europe about the dangers of relying too heavily on Russian energy. The use of assassination as a tool to silence dissidents has further exemplified the ruthlessness of Putin's regime. From the polonium poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko in London to the near-fatal poisoning of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, the Kremlin's reach has extended far beyond Russia's borders. These incidents, though brazen, serve as chilling reminders of how dissent is treated under Putin's rule, with brutality and impunity. Yet, perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Putin's reign is not the acts of aggression themselves but the West's often tepid response to them. Despite mounting evidence of election interference, state-sponsored assassinations, and strategic corruption, Western governments have largely failed to counteract the Kremlin's influence effectively. Sanctions have been imposed, but their impact has been limited, as Putin and his oligarchs have learned to adapt, using offshore accounts and complex financial structures to evade restrictions. In the end, Catherine Belton's Putin's People is more than just a biography of a leader, it is a cautionary tale of how a country can be reshaped from within and weaponized against the world. Putin's rise from a KGB operative in East Germany to one of the most powerful and feared leaders in the world is a story of calculated ruthlessness, manipulation, and unchecked ambition. It is a warning to the West that the methods of control and influence perfected in Russia may well be exported globally, and that the cost of ignoring these tactics could be nothing less than the erosion of democracy itself.